Keanu Reeves thought he was alone in his studio until he saw the janitor's face and time stopped. It was the teacher who once saved his life, now sweeping floors in silence, hiding a secret buried for decades. Why did he disappear from the world, and why does he refuse to be saved? Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The parking lot of Reeves' studio was empty, cloaked in a hush that only arrived after midnight. The city around it still buzzed faintly in the distance, but inside these gates, the world felt paused, like someone had held their breath and forgotten to exhale. Keanu stepped out of his black SUV and closed the door gently behind him. He wasn't here to film or rehearse, not tonight. He just needed quiet. For the past few months, he'd been working on something deeply personal, a tribute film, not for the box office, but for himself. A project that traced his early years, the people who shaped him, the voices that echoed in his soul long before he stood on red carpets. He had just left a long evening in post-production, reviewing old footage and forgotten letters. It was nearly 1 a.m., but he couldn't bring himself to go home. Something in him still felt unfinished. He walked across the studio lot, his boots echoing against the concrete. The sound stages loomed like sleeping giants, dark and cavernous. He passed the door to stage 3, paused, and stepped inside. It was cold. The air smelled faintly of sawdust, fabric, and the faint metallic trace of aging spotlight mounts. The overhead lights were off, but some motion sensors triggered faint pathway lighting as he walked through the empty stage. This place had once been alive. Dozens of crew members shouting, actors rehearsing, lights buzzing, cameras clicking into place. But tonight, the silence was almost sacred. He needed this quiet to think, to remember. As he walked past the racks of props and the scaffolding, he heard something he didn't expect. A soft, rhythmic sound, swish, tap. He stopped. His body instinctively tensed. It was the sound of a broom sweeping against concrete, measured and unhurried. He followed the sound slowly, rounding the corner near the costume cages. And that's when he saw him. At the far end of the room, under the glow of a single hanging light, stood an elderly man. His back was slightly hunched, and his shoulders curved inward with quiet dignity. He wore a plain Navy janitor's uniform. His silver hair was thin but neatly combed. His hands, aged but steady, held the wooden handle of a wide push broom. Each movement was precise, like someone who believed cleanliness was an art form, not a chore. Keanu's feet froze. It couldn't be. No. He was imagining it. The lighting must be playing tricks on his mind. But when the man turned toward the light and looked up, the years collapsed in a breath. Those eyes, those same steady, watchful, compassionate eyes. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move, couldn't blink. Mr. Nathaniel Hargrove, his childhood drama teacher, the man who had changed the course of his life with a script, a quiet voice, and a belief in a teenage boy no one else saw. A man Keanu thought he'd lost forever. But he was here, and he was sweeping the floor. Keanu took a cautious step forward, unsure if his voice would even work. The moment felt unreal, like a scene from a dream too fragile to touch. But Mr. Hargrove saw him first. Their eyes met, and the broom stopped mid-sweep. There was the briefest flicker. Recognition, surprise, something deeper. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. The old man straightened slightly, adjusted his grip on the broom, and gave a small nod, as if Keanu were just any passerby. "Evening," Mr. Hargrove said. His voice still had that same warmth, gravelly yet gentle. A voice made for storytelling, a voice that used to guide trembling high school students across a stage with patience and pride. But now, it was carefully neutral. Keanu couldn't find words. His heart was racing in his chest. I know you, he finally said, his voice quiet. The old man looked at him, then away. Don't think so, he replied softly. Just here to clean up. Late shift. Keanu stepped closer. Mr. Hargrove, he said, more firmly this time. It's Keanu. A pause. The broom handle creaked slightly under the weight of the old man's hands. His posture stiffened. For a split second, it looked like he might drop the act, but then he gave a faint smile. Too polite to be real. Sorry, son. I think you've got me confused with someone else. No, Keanu said, shaking his head. No, I haven't. He took another step forward, now only a few feet away. Under the dim light, he could see the lines on Mr. Hargrove's face, deeper than before, but the eyes hadn't changed, steady, wise, haunted. You were my drama teacher in Toronto, 1983. You gave me a copy of Hamlet. You told me my voice mattered even when I didn't believe it did. The old man closed his eyes briefly. A crack in the armor. That was a long time ago, he said. Keanu nodded. It was everything to me. Stillness hung between them. Mr. Hargrove's hands tightened around the broom handle. I didn't expect to see anyone in here, he said after a moment, almost apologetically. I just clean up after the crew clears out. You work here? Third-party service. They don't know my real name. I sign in as Nick. Keanu's chest ached. So it was true. The man who had given him his first sense of self, who had once stood in front of an auditorium full of kids and taught them how to tell the truth through fiction, was now sweeping empty sound stages under a false name. Why? Keanu whispered. Why would you hide? The old man didn't answer. He just lowered his eyes and gently pushed the broom to the side. The conversation was over. But Keanu stayed right there, rooted in place, his heart breaking without a script to follow. Keanu stood in silence, watching the man who had once changed his life walk slowly toward a supply cart at the edge of the stage. The broom was parked gently next to a yellow mop bucket. Every movement was quiet, deliberate, practiced. Mr. Hargrove didn't look back. For a moment, Keanu considered letting him go. Maybe that would have been easier, less complicated. But something in his chest wouldn't let him. He took a breath. I used to wait for Saturdays just to hear you talk, he said quietly. You told me stories that made me feel like I could belong in the world. You were the first person who ever told me I didn't have to be loud to be strong. Mr. Hargrove paused mid-reach, his hand hovering over a spray bottle. His shoulders rose, then lowered, but he didn't turn around. I kept that copy of Hamlet, the one with your notes in the margins, Keanu continued. I read it so many times the pages fell out. That book got me through more auditions than I can count. Nothing. Just the sound of distant city noise outside the walls. I became who I am because of you. Mr. Hargrove finally turned. His expression was unreadable. Behind the tired eyes was something flickering, grief maybe, or guilt, or something heavier than both. I don't deserve that kind of credit, he said. Not anymore. Yes, you do, Keanu said, stepping closer. You do. A long silence fell between them. Mr. Hargrove leaned against the cart now, one hand resting on the edge, the other still gripping the broom. He looked down, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter. I'm just a man who made too many mistakes, that's all. Keanu shook his head. That's not who you were to me. That's not who you are now. Mr. Hargrove's jaw clenched. His eyes met Keanu's. Finally, fully, and for one brief, powerful moment, time felt like it folded. A teenager looking up at his mentor. A mentor looking back at the boy he once believed in. You shouldn't be here, the old man said, voice trembling slightly. You've got the whole world in your hands, and I'm just sweeping what's left of mine. You're wrong. Keanu said softly. "I've got the world in my hands because of you." Neither of them moved. Neither looked away. Finally, Mr. Hargrove reached for his cardigan, picked up a rag, and quietly said, "Place gets dusty when the lights go out." Keanu watched as he turned his back again and resumed wiping down the counter near the tool rack. The moment had passed. The curtain had fallen. But Keanu didn't walk away. He stood there long after Mr. Hargrove disappeared into the shadows of the stage. And somewhere deep inside him, something had shifted. Because some reunions don't happen with hugs or fanfare. Some start in silence, with nothing more than the sound of a broom echoing in the dark. In the fall of 1982, Keanu Reeves was 15 years old and felt like a shadow in a world that demanded noise. At De La Salle College in Toronto, where boys were loud and fast and certain of themselves, Keanu was quiet, hesitant, and different. His speech stuttered at times, especially when he was nervous, and he was nervous a lot. He didn't fit the mold. He didn't play hockey. He didn't crack jokes. He didn't fight back when the older boys knocked his books from his hands. Instead, he watched, he listened, and most of the time he kept to himself. One rainy Tuesday, a flyer was taped outside the cafeteria door. It read, "Auditions for the spring play, all students welcome." The announcement might have gone unnoticed by most, but something in Keanu stirred. Not because he loved acting. He didn't even know if he could act. It was the word welcome. That word felt rare. He folded the flyer into his pocket and carried it around for a week before showing up to the theater room after school. When he walked in, there were already a dozen boys sitting in the first two rows, laughing and throwing paper at each other. Keanu stood in the back, unsure if he should sit or turn around. That's when the door to the prop room creaked open and a man walked in, tall, slightly rumpled, wearing a scarf even indoors. His presence was calm, but commanding. His eyes scanned the room and landed on Keanu. "You in the back," the man said. "Are you here to audition or hide?" Keanu froze. The boys laughed. The man held up a hand to silence them. "I meant that sincerely," he added. "There's courage in both." Keanu hesitated, then walked forward. "I am Keanu," he said quietly. The man nodded. "I'm Mr. Hargrove. Welcome." From that moment on, everything began to shift. Over the next few weeks, Keanu stayed after school every day. At first, he read lines softly, his voice cracking on certain vowels, his hands buried in his jacket pockets. But Mr. Hargrove didn't mock him. He didn't even correct him much at first. Instead, he asked questions. "What do you think this character wants? Why do you think he's angry? What would it feel like if he wasn't?" The questions weren't about acting. They were about emotion, motive, truth. And slowly, Keanu began to understand that acting wasn't pretending, it was revealing. One day, after a rehearsal where Keanu had stumbled over his lines again and again, he stayed behind to help Mr. Hargrove stack chairs. He felt defeated, embarrassed. He apologized for ruining the scene. Mr. Hargrove handed him a worn paperback book. The spine was cracked, the corners were frayed. It was Shakespeare's Hamlet. "You're meant to speak for the quiet ones," he told him. "The world listens to the loudest voices, but the loudest voices don't always tell the truth. The truth lives in silence. Your job is to speak it." Keanu held the book with both hands. Something inside him clicked into place. That night, Keanu read Hamlet until 2 a.m. The language was dense, unfamiliar, but it stirred something in him. He didn't understand every word, but he understood the feeling. Loneliness, conflict, doubt, rage that couldn't find a voice. When Hamlet whispered, "I have of late, but wherefore I know not, lost all my mirth," Keanu felt like someone had finally described what he couldn't say out loud. The next day at rehearsal, he asked Mr. Hargrove if he could try that scene. The older students laughed. They thought he was joking. Mr. Hargrove didn't laugh. He stepped forward, looked Keanu straight in the eye and said, "Yes, Let's see what you've got." The room quieted. Keanu walked to the center of the stage. His heart pounded, his hands trembled slightly, but he opened the book and began to speak, slowly, then stronger. The stutter didn't vanish. It transformed. It gave rhythm to the words, depth to the pauses. When he finished, the room was silent. No laughter, no mockery, just stillness. After a moment, Mr. Hargrove nodded and said, "You just made Hamlet matter." From then on, something in Keanu started to grow. Confidence didn't come in leaps. It came in whispers. In the way he stopped apologizing every time he misspoke. In the way he started raising his hand in class. In the way he carried himself down the hallway with a little more weight in his step. The bullying didn't vanish, but it no longer controlled him. Mr. Hargrove didn't just teach performance. He taught presence. He made his students practice silence, listening, breath. He had a rule: no shouting on stage unless you could first command the room with a whisper. If they don't lean in to hear you, he'd say, you're not acting, you're yelling. Keanu learned how to listen before he spoke, how to read a room, how to stand still and say more with his eyes than most could with pages of dialogue. He was never the loudest, but he became one of the most compelling. Outside of rehearsals, Mr. Hargrove stayed late with students who had no one waiting at home. He kept a jar of granola bars in his office for kids who skipped lunch. And once, when Keanu's bike was stolen and he started walking 2 miles to school each day, a folded bus pass mysteriously appeared in his locker. He never mentioned it, but Keanu knew. There were no grand speeches, no pep talks, just quiet guidance, the kind that stayed in your bones long after the moment passed. By the spring of 1983, Keanu had earned the lead role in the school's annual production. His Hamlet was raw, uncertain, and real. He didn't mimic other actors. He performed like a boy who knew what grief felt like. When he knelt at the end of Act 5, his face streaked with tears, the audience didn't clap right away. They sat in silence, moved, because they believed him. For the next 2 years, Keanu's world revolved around that small theater room tucked behind the gymnasium. When life outside the walls felt chaotic, his mother's long work hours, his stepfather's absence, the lingering ache of being the kid who didn't quite fit, Mr. Hargrove's classroom was a sanctuary. It was the one place where being sensitive wasn't a flaw, but a strength. They spent long afternoons dissecting scenes from plays most teenagers had never heard of. Mr. Hargrove introduced him to Tennessee Williams, Chekhov, and Beckett, but more than the scripts, he introduced Keanu to himself. He would ask questions that no adult had ever bothered to ask. What scares you the most in silence? When you speak, who are you hoping hears it? What would you say to the part of yourself that wants to give up? These weren't acting notes. These were lifelines. Mr. Hargrove never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He had a way of standing beside you, quietly, until you realized you were stronger than you thought. He never told Keanu he was talented. He told him he was honest. That mattered more. Then, in the fall of 1984, everything changed. Without warning, Keanu's family announced they were moving. His mother had taken a job offer across the country. The decision was final. Keanu didn't get to say goodbye the way he wanted. On his last day, he came by the theater after school, hoping to find Mr. Hargrove alone. He did. The classroom was dark except for the light over Mr. Hargrove's desk. He was grading monologue assignments by hand, glasses perched on the edge of his nose. "I'm leaving," Keanu said from the doorway. Mr. Hargrove looked up slowly. "I know," he replied. Keanu stepped forward. "I didn't want to go without saying thank you." Mr. Hargrove opened a drawer and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Keanu with care. Inside was a small leather journal, blank pages, bound with soft thread. "Write it all down," he said. "The roles you'll play, the things you feel, the parts of yourself you're afraid to lose. Write down every impossible dream." Keanu stared at the journal. "I don't know if I'll ever become anything." Mr. Hargrove smiled. "You already are something. You're someone who listens, someone who feels. That's rare. Hold on to it." They hugged. It wasn't long, but it was the kind of embrace that speaks without words. Then Keanu laughed. And for years he thought about that theater room, that dog-eared Hamlet, and the man who never asked for anything but gave him everything. He carried the journal through every phase of his life. He just never imagined he'd one day find Mr. Hargrove again, sweeping floors in the shadows of a studio that only existed because of what that man once saw in him. Keanu sat in his dimly lit kitchen the next morning, nursing a half-drunk cup of coffee that had long gone cold. He hadn't slept. His mind kept replaying that single moment from the night before. Mr. Hargrove, standing under the light, broom in hand, voice soft, eyes tired. The janitor uniform couldn't erase who he was. That man had shaped him. That man had changed his life. But now he was pretending they had never met. Keanu couldn't let it go. Later that day, during a meeting with his production team, his mind wandered. One of his longtime friends and fellow producer, Jordan Levy, noticed. "You okay?" Jordan asked during a break. "You've been somewhere else all day." Keanu hesitated, then finally said it. "I saw someone last night." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Someone important?" Keanu nodded. "My old drama teacher from high school. I haven't seen him in nearly 40 years. "That's incredible. Did he recognize you?" Keanu looked down at the table. He pretended he didn't. Jordan leaned in. "What do you mean?" "Was mopping the floors. In my studio. Same man. Same eyes. But he called himself Nick. And when I said his real name, he just turned away." Jordan was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, "Didn't you try looking for him once? I remember you saying something years ago." "I did," Keanu replied. "I looked everywhere." He remembered it clearly. It was after Speed had made him a household name. When the press tours died down and things got quiet again, Keanu started trying to track down people from his past. He wanted to thank the ones who mattered, and Mr. Hargrove had mattered more than anyone. But when he started digging, something strange happened. There was no trace. He'd called his old school, De La Salle College, asking if they had any forwarding information for Nathaniel Hargrove. The receptionist had paused before responding. "I'm sorry," she'd said carefully. "We don't have any current records under that name." "No forwarding address?" Keanu had asked. "No retirement notice?" "Nothing," she replied. "It's like he vanished." Keanu tried reaching out to other teachers he vaguely remembered, but none of them could help. One had retired to Vancouver. Another didn't even remember Hargrove. A third said, "Wasn't he the quiet one who left after that issue with the student council?" But no one could explain what issue meant. Eventually, Keanu gave up the search. Life moved forward, roles came and went, years passed. But the guilt remained. He had never said goodbye, and he had never said thank you. He told Jordan all of it now, how he'd kept the journal Mr. Hargrove gave him, how his words had guided nearly every major performance, how he'd tried to find him but kept hitting walls. Jordan listened quietly, then said, "Maybe he didn't want to be found." Keanu shook his head. "Maybe. But last night, I saw something in his eyes. He wasn't lost, he was hiding." That evening, Keanu couldn't sit still. He left his house just after sundown, driving through light traffic until the skyline melted into the low industrial zone where his studio lot sat. The security guard at the gate barely looked up when Keanu passed through. Everyone knew his car. The soundstage was quiet. Too quiet. He parked near the back entrance, the same door he had entered the night before. It was unlocked. The overhead fluorescents were dim, casting soft glows across the concrete floors. Somewhere in the distance, a door clicked shut. But when Keanu followed the sound, the hallway was empty. He made his way toward the janitor's supply closet, the same one Mr. Hargrove, Nick, had disappeared into. It was locked. He stood there for a moment, then gently knocked. Nothing. He knocked again, louder. "Mr. Hargrove?" he called. "It's Keanu, please." No answer. He pulled out his phone and opened the studio's internal directory. He searched for maintenance staff, night crew, temp hires, subcontractors. Dozens of names scrolled past, but none of them were Nathaniel Hargrove, and none of them were Nick. Not even under aliases. Keanu stared at the screen, stunned. Either Mr. Hargrove wasn't officially working there, or someone had removed his name. He walked the halls for nearly half an hour, checking every stage, every darkened set, even the break room. All empty. No mop bucket, no broom, no quiet figure in the shadows. Gone? By the time he returned to the main lobby, the air outside had cooled. Fog drifted in from the lot, curling over the pavement like smoke. Keanu sat on a bench by the reception desk, heart sinking. It didn't make sense. Had he imagined it? Was it a trick of memory, some look-alike conjured by nostalgia? No, he had spoken to him. He remembered the calluses on his hands, the scent of the old floor wax that still clung to his clothes, the voice that had once recited Shakespeare with thunderous grace. Keanu stood up and checked the lobby cameras. No footage. Security had purged the logs for routine privacy protocols. Nothing from the previous night remained. No images of the janitor, no record of that quiet exchange. Keanu exhaled sharply. He was chasing a ghost. But deep down, he knew it wasn't a ghost. It was a man. A man who had once stood like a lighthouse in a stormy chapter of his life, and who now had chosen to vanish. Again, he made one final round through the building before walking out under the pale streetlight. The wind stirred the leaves in the alley beside the loading dock. There was no trace left behind. No rag, no cart, no cleaning bottle. Just silence. And Keanu Reeves, standing still, feeling 17 again, abandoned, confused, full of questions, with nowhere to place them. He looked up at the stars and whispered, "Why would you come back here, just to disappear again?" The next morning, Keanu called in a favor. He reached out to Linda Carson, an old friend and private investigator who'd once helped him reconnect with a long-lost childhood friend. Linda had always been discreet, never asked unnecessary questions. But when Keanu explained the situation, even she sounded uncertain. "You're saying he used to teach you in high school, then vanished, and now he's working in your studio as a janitor under a different name?" Keanu hesitated. "Yes, at least I think he is. Was. He's gone again." "What's the full name you remember?" "Nathaniel Hargrove, but he went by Nate. In school, we called him Mr. Hargrove. Last night he said his name was Nick. Any date of birth, middle initial?" "Not exactly, but I have the yearbook, and I have his handwriting." Keanu scanned and sent the note from the inside cover of the Hamlet copy, still in perfect condition after all these years. The inscription read, "Speak not to be heard, but to be felt. N.H." Linda promised to run what she could. Keanu spent the day pacing, checking his phone every 10 minutes. He wasn't even sure what he wanted to find. An address, a family member, maybe even an explanation. But more than anything, he needed to know Mr. Hargrove was okay, that he hadn't fallen so far the world had forgotten him. That night, he returned to the studio again. Still no sign. The air felt colder. The building felt emptier. Even the echo of his own footsteps seemed distant, as if the space had swallowed the memory whole. Keanu sat down in the empty break room and opened the Hamlet copy again. He ran his fingers over the worn pages, his eyes scanning the underlined passages, the scribbled notes in the margins. He could still hear Mr. Hargrove's voice in his head, reading them aloud. "To thine own self be true," one line was circled 3 times. And then another near the end of the play, "The readiness is all." Keanu swallowed hard. He'd always wondered why Mr. Hargrove left so suddenly, why his name disappeared from school records, why no one had answers. Now, the deeper question weighed heavier. Why was he hiding? Why sweep floors in silence when the world had once leaned forward to hear him speak? His phone buzzed. It was Linda. The message was short. "No recent activity under Nathaniel Hargrove in Ontario. Last verifiable record ends 1987. No death certificate, no property, no taxes, no marriage, nothing." Keanu stared at the message, heart thudding. It was like Mr. Hargrove had chosen to erase himself, deliberately, as if he believed he didn't deserve to exist in the light anymore. Keanu stood, closed the book, and looked around the studio one last time. Somewhere, not far from this very room, the man who once taught him to feel had quietly swept through a space built on his legacy and walked out the back door, unseen. But Keanu had seen him. And this time, he wasn't going to let him disappear for good. 2 days later, Linda called back with an update. Her voice was calm but carried the weight of something deeper beneath the surface. "I found him," she said. Keanu closed his eyes. He hadn't realized how much hope he'd been holding back. Linda continued, "He goes by Nick Harvey now. No legal change on record. It looks like an alias he started using informally in the late 80s. Since then, he's picked up mostly cash-based night jobs, custodial work, warehouse shifts, groundskeeping, nothing permanent. Always part-time, always low profile." Keanu paced the edge of his living room. Where does he live? A tiny senior housing unit in the east end of the city. Nothing fancy, just a 1-room apartment in a subsidized complex for low-income retirees. He was silent for a moment. "Is he okay?" Linda paused. "He's alive, but it's not a good life, Keanu. His income's barely above the poverty line, no known family, no visitors. The building manager said he's quiet, pays in cash, and never causes trouble. Always says please and thank you. Keeps to himself." A knot twisted in Keanu's chest. "And nobody knows who he really is. Not that I could find. No teaching credentials listed anywhere recent. It's like he buried that part of himself on purpose." Keanu felt a wave of guilt rush over him. This was the man who had stood beside him in the shadows when no one else did. The man who gave him Shakespeare when others gave him silence. And now, that man lived alone, sweeping floors in the dark, pretending to be someone else. He remembered the way Mr. Hargrove had turned away that night, the way he'd muttered his name like it was shameful. Nick. Not Nate. Not the name that once made students sit up and pay attention. Keanu looked out the window. The city glittered in the distance, but it felt far away. He thought about the young version of himself, the boy who couldn't look people in the eye, who mumbled through sentences, who didn't know where he belonged, and how everything changed because one teacher didn't look away. He owed him more than this. That night, Keanu sat at his kitchen table with a pen and paper. He began writing down what he remembered. Not just names or scenes, but feelings. The way Mr. Hargrove's voice trembled slightly when he read aloud. The way he stayed late after class, even when no one else did. The quiet advice. The moments between the lines. The things that never made it into school records or resumes. Then he opened his laptop and pulled up the address Linda had given him. The complex was small, faded brick, narrow walkways, a few trees that looked like they'd stopped trying years ago. It didn't match the image in his head, the teacher who once stood with authority on stage, commanding silence with a single glance. Something had happened. Something had broken. And Keanu was determined to find out what. The next morning, Keanu sat in his parked car across the street from the senior housing complex. staring through the windshield at the modest red brick building. There was no doorman, no security gate, just a plain, weathered entrance with a buzzing intercom panel and a faded tape to the glass. Quiet hours begin at 8 p.m. He dressed simply, dark jeans, a flannel shirt, a worn baseball cap pulled low. He didn't want to draw attention. This wasn't about celebrity. This was about memory, about debt. He waited. Eventually, around 8:45 a.m., the side door opened. Out walked a man in a tan windbreaker and a navy baseball cap. Slouched posture, clean shoes, small paper bag in one hand. It was him. He, like Nick Harvey, walked slowly to the corner store. There was no urgency in his steps, just the steady rhythm of someone who had learned to move without being noticed. He didn't look up, didn't glance around. When he entered the shop, Keanu followed, keeping a respectful distance. Inside, Mr. Hargrove moved with practiced familiarity. A carton of milk, a day-old bagel, a folded newspaper. He exchanged a few quiet words with the cashier, paid in coins, and gave a faint smile before heading back out. Keanu stood in the cereal aisle, heart pounding. He wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. He watched the old man disappear down the street, back toward that lonely apartment building. The man who once encouraged him to take risks, to feel everything on stage, now looked like a shadow of himself. Smaller, quieter, almost erased. Back in the car, Keanu called Linda again. "Do we know anything about his past 30 years?" he asked. "I've pulled what I can," she replied. "There's a pattern. He stayed in Toronto until around 1987, then abruptly left the teaching registry. No resignation letter, no official dismissal, just vanished from education. After that, he worked odd jobs across Canada. Nothing lasted more than a year or two, always under informal names. No family?" Keanu asked. "None listed. No marriage license, no children. I couldn't find any siblings either. It's like he's been running solo since the day he left that school." Keanu leaned back, eyes scanning the worn sidewalk in front of the building. "But running from what?" "That's the thing," Linda said. "There's no legal record of any scandal, no lawsuit, no criminal charges, just whispers. I tracked down one retired teacher from your high school who vaguely remembered Hargrove. He said something about a conflict with a parent that got swept under the rug." Keanu narrowed his eyes. "A parent?" "Apparently Hargrove defended a student during some disciplinary action. Rumor was the student came from a powerful family. Things got messy, but no one ever gave a full story." Keanu clenched the steering wheel. The man who taught him to speak the truth may have paid a price for doing just that. And now, he was paying for it with silence. Keanu sat in silence long after the call ended. His thoughts were tangled, but one thing was clear. Mr. Hargrove hadn't just disappeared by accident. He had been pushed, quietly and deliberately, out of the world he helped build. And then he had chosen not to return. But why? That night, Keanu returned home and pulled out a box he hadn't touched in years. It was filled with keepsakes from his early career, scripts, headshots, and clippings from local theater productions. At the bottom, wrapped in an old scarf, was a photo. It was a cast picture from a high school production of The Crucible. A 17-year-old Keanu stood off to the side, awkward and stiff, barely able to meet the camera's gaze. But behind him stood Mr. Hargrove, arms folded, eyes full of quiet fire. He was proud, not of the performance, but of the transformation. Keanu remembered that night vividly. He had almost quit the play 2 weeks before opening night after being humiliated by another student. But Mr. Hargrove had pulled him aside backstage and said something he never forgot. "Let them laugh now, but you're going to show them how silence can speak louder than shouting." Keanu had channeled every ounce of pain into his performance, and when the curtain fell, the laughter never came back. That night changed him forever. But now he couldn't shake the feeling that the price of that wisdom had cost Mr. Hargrove everything. The next day, Keanu called Linda again. "I want to know more," he said firmly. "I need to know what really happened back then. Why he left, who pushed him out. I don't care how buried it is, I need answers." "I'll keep digging," she promised. "But be careful. If he's been hiding this long, there may be a reason." Keanu nodded. He understood. But he also knew something deeper. Sometimes silence isn't a choice, it's a sentence. And someone had sentenced Nathaniel Hargrove to a life of invisibility. He couldn't let that stand. Later that afternoon, Keanu returned to the building and waited near the front steps. Around 4 p.m., the door opened again. Mr. Hargrove stepped out slowly, this time carrying a canvas tote with a book tucked inside. Keanu stepped forward gently. "Mr. Hargrove, please, just give me a minute." The older man froze mid-step. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, slowly, his shoulders dropped. His eyes lifted. There was no confusion in them, only weariness and recognition. Keanu stepped closer. "I know who you are. I never forgot. And I think you owe yourself more than this." Mr. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but he didn't walk away. And in that silence, something cracked open. A moment suspended between past and present. The student who had once needed to be seen had returned, not as a boy lost in doubt, but as a man, ready to help the one who once gave him everything. Keanu returned the next evening, this time walking directly to apartment 3B. The hallway smelled faintly of old varnish and brewed coffee. The floor creaked beneath his steps as he stopped in front of the plain beige door. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he raised his hand and knocked. There was movement inside. Slow steps, a pause behind the door, then it opened, just a crack. Mr. Hargrove stood behind the chain lock, eyes narrowed. His voice was quiet and firm. "I told you, Keanu, I don't want visitors." Keanu didn't move. "I'm not here to bother you. I just want to talk. You already said what you needed to. You saw I'm alive. Now leave it alone." Keanu looked him in the eye. "You gave me time when no one else did. Let me return the favor." Mr. Hargrove didn't answer. The chain lingered for a long second. Then, slowly, he unlatched the lock and opened the door wider. Keanu stepped inside. The apartment was small but neat. A single armchair faced a tiny television set. A battered bookshelf leaned against the far wall, crammed with old paperbacks and scripts. The kitchenette was spotless. No dishes in the sink, no clutter. Just quiet order. But it was the walls that caught Keanu's breath. Old black and white photos faded at the corners. Handwritten cast lists, still pinned to corkboard squares. Playbills from high school productions dating back over 40 years. One from 1982 caught his eye. The Crucible, the year Keanu had played John Proctor. The yellowed flyer listed the cast. His name sat near the bottom, written in neat cursive, Keanu Reeves as John Proctor. And in the corner, in even smaller print, directed by Nathaniel Hargrove. Keanu's voice came softly. "You kept all of this?" Mr. Hargrove moved toward the sink, pouring a glass of water. "Some habits die hard. Memory's a strange thing. Even when you don't want to look back, the past hangs around." Keanu stepped closer, eyes still on the wall. "You were more than a teacher to us." Mr. Hargrove didn't turn around. "Don't put me on a pedestal, Keanu. I don't belong on one." There was silence for a moment. Then Keanu said, "What happened?" Mr. Hargrove set the glass down. His hands trembled just slightly. He leaned on the counter and exhaled. "There was a student," he said. "His name was Thomas. Talented, troubled, came from a powerful family. His father didn't approve of his choices." Keanu waited. One day, Thomas came to me in tears, said he wanted to leave home, said he didn't feel safe. I told him to wait. I told him we'd figure something out together. But that night he ran, and the next morning, his father was at my classroom door, accusing, screaming, said I planted ideas in his son's head. Mr. Hargrove paused, voice gravelly. I was put on leave, then quietly asked to resign. No charges, no record, but no job offers ever came again. My name was stained. He looked at Keanu finally. I failed that boy. I failed them all. Keanu remained still, taking in the words, the weight behind them. His eyes moved from Mr. Hargrove's face to the wall of mementos, frozen moments of young lives shaped by the man standing before him. He took a breath, slow and measured. You didn't fail me, Keanu said. Mr. Hargrove turned away again, shoulders tense. That's kind of you, but I know what I did. I encouraged a boy to believe in himself, and it nearly destroyed him. Thomas never came back. No one ever heard from him again. His father blamed me. So did the school in their quiet way, and eventually, I started blaming myself too. Keanu stepped forward. So what did you do? You disappeared, changed your name, hid in the shadows and told yourself you didn't matter anymore? Mr. Hargrove's jaw tightened. That's exactly what I did. His voice dropped to a whisper. When you believe you've ruined a young person's life, it does something to you. You start to think maybe your instincts can't be trusted. Maybe your voice causes harm. So you stop using it. You let the world move on without you. Keanu looked around again, at the memories pinned to plaster and hope. Then why did you keep these? Mr. Hargrove's eyes flicked to the wall. Because for a while, I thought I mattered. I thought I was making a difference. You did. I made a mistake, Keanu. Keanu shook his head slowly. You were the first person who looked me in the eyes and said, you have something worth saying. I carried that through every audition, every rejection, every time I thought I wasn't enough. You showed me how to feel without shame. You taught me to believe that silence could carry meaning. Mr. Hargrove sat down heavily in the old armchair, the weight of the past folding over his shoulders. And what did that belief cost you? It saved me. The room fell quiet again. The only sound was the ticking of a clock on the bookshelf. Keanu walked over to the old playbill and gently took it off the wall. He held it out. This was my beginning. I don't care what the school said. I don't care what Thomas's father did. That stage, that voice, you gave it to me, and you've spent the last 40 years believing you broke something. But I'm telling you now, you built something. In me. In others. Mr. Hargrove didn't reach for the playbill, but his eyes softened just slightly. I watched your films, he said after a moment. All of them. I sat in the back row with a hoodie pulled low and popcorn that always went cold. I never missed one. And every time I thought, I helped shape that. And then I'd remind myself not to feel proud, because I didn't deserve it. Keanu's voice cracked. You do. You always did. The silence that followed was no longer heavy with shame. It was something else. A reckoning. Mr. Hargrove leaned back in the chair, eyes fixed on a point far away, as if trying to unsee decades of self-imposed exile. His hands, once expressive on stage, now trembled in his lap. But he didn't speak, not yet. Keanu stepped closer, kneeling so they were eye to eye. I spent years wondering why I never got to say goodbye, Keanu said gently. One day you were there, and then you weren't. I thought I'd done something wrong. Maybe I disappointed you. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Mr. Hargrove's eyes widened in disbelief. You thought that? For a long time, but the truth is, you were my first real mentor. You didn't just teach acting. You taught me how to carry pain and turn it into something human. You told me I was meant to speak for the quiet ones. I never forgot that. I built my whole career on it." The old man looked down at his trembling hands. "I never knew. I thought everyone forgot me, that maybe I imagined it all. Those nights after rehearsal, the applause, the hope. It's been so long since anyone called me Mr. Hargrove." Keanu smiled gently. "You never stopped being him. Not to me." Mr. Hargrove looked around his apartment, suddenly aware of the silence it held, of how many years had passed. "I got old. I got tired. And I started believing the worst thing anyone can believe, that I no longer had anything to give." Keanu placed the old playbill carefully back on the wall. "Then maybe it's time to start believing something new." Mr. Hargrove looked at him, cautious. "Like what?" "Like redemption doesn't come from staying in the shadows. It comes from stepping out again, even if your voice shakes." A tear slipped down the old man's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Keanu stood. "I don't want this to be our ending. I want to understand. I want to help." Mr. Hargrove nodded slowly. "I don't know if I can be that person again." "You already are. You just forgot." The apartment, for all its stillness, felt changed. Not louder, just more alive. As Keanu turned to leave, he paused at the door. "I'll be back tomorrow. I'm directing something personal. It's about people like you. People who gave others their voices, even when the world tried to silence theirs. I want you to see it." Mr. Hargrove didn't answer right away, but this time he didn't say no. As Keanu stepped into the hallway and the door clicked shut behind him, he felt something settle in his chest. Not closure, not yet, but something like the beginning of healing. And in apartment 3B, the man once known as Mr. Hargrove sat still, staring at the playbill on the wall, and whispered to himself for the first time in decades, "I saved someone." Keanu returned home just past midnight. The quiet of his house wrapped around him like a familiar blanket, but his heart felt anything but calm. He sat at the kitchen table, letting the silence settle. On the counter sat a box he hadn't touched in years, a wooden chest, worn at the edges, that held pieces of his youth. He opened it slowly, sifting through photos, old letters, and backstage passes. Near the bottom, beneath a stack of postcards he once meant to send, was a slim, leather-bound journal. The cover was cracked with age, but the initials still faintly pressed into the corner, KCR, reminded him exactly who it belonged to. He opened it and was immediately hit with a familiar scent of ink and paper that had been stored for too long. Inside the front cover, in bold black ink, was a message he had read once, a long time ago, and forgotten. "Use this to find your voice. Then use your voice to lift others." Mr. Hargrove? Keanu's fingers traced the handwriting as a flood of memories rushed back. The journal had been a gift on the closing night of The Crucible, handed to him backstage when the applause was still echoing in the gymnasium auditorium. At 16, he hadn't fully understood what it meant. But now? He turned the pages carefully. Each one was filled with handwritten quotes, prompts, and notes scribbled in Mr. Hargrove's precise, deliberate script. "Don't try to be loud, try to be true. If you feel the silence, the audience will lean in. Be still, be honest, let the world move around you." Keanu paused, his thumb brushing the edge of a dog-eared page. There were stains from old tears there. His or Mr. Hargrove's, he couldn't tell. He read the words again, slower this time, each line hitting deeper than the last. One page held an entire paragraph, something Mr. Hargrove had written, in the corner, with no context, but now felt like prophecy. Acting is not about pretending to be someone else. It's about showing others that they're not alone. Every person who walks into that theater is hoping to see something familiar in a stranger. Give them that. Make them feel seen. Keanu closed his eyes. That line, that message. He'd forgotten it was ever said aloud, but he had lived by it without even realizing it. He turned to a final page near the back, one that had always puzzled him before. But now it made him stop cold. In bold, slightly shakier handwriting. Don't act to be seen. Act so others feel seen. Keanu stared at the words until his vision blurred, his breath caught, and suddenly, everything inside him broke open. This man, whom the world had forgotten, whom a single moment had pushed into decades of obscurity, had still left a mark powerful enough to shape a life, a career, a legacy. Keanu bowed his head over the journal and let the tears come. The tears came, slowly at first, just a few quiet drops on the open page. But once they started, Keanu couldn't stop them. He pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes, trying to breathe through the grief that had been waiting silently inside him all this time. Not grief for a death, but grief for something else. Grief for the silence. Grief for the years that Mr. Hargrove had vanished, for the years Keanu had buried the ache of not knowing why. He let the journal rest on the table, pages open like a wound. Everything in it felt sacred now. Every line, every word was a reminder that the person who had once seen him, really seen him, had never stopped giving, even when the world stopped listening. "You may stay." He stood and walked into the living room, journal still in hand. He sat down on the couch and flipped through the pages again, this time stopping at little things. Side notes Mr. Hargrove had written just for him. "Your strength is in your stillness. Rewatch your own silence. It will teach you more than applause. You don't need to fill a room, you need to hold one." Keanu smiled through the tears. He remembered how Mr. Hargrove had never raised his voice, even when the class was out of control. He had this way of making everything quieter, calmer, like the world slowed down when he was speaking. Keanu had spent a career chasing that same energy, without realizing he was imitating his first teacher all along. He ran his fingers across the binding of the journal and whispered into the silence of the room, "You taught me how to see the world without needing to stand above it." He thought about the roles he had chosen over the years. So many characters who lived on the margins, loners, misfits, men burdened by pain. He had found something real in all of them. Not because they were flashy or heroic, but because they carried weight in their quiet. They moved through life like Mr. Hargrove had, without fanfare, but with purpose. It wasn't until now that Keanu realized just how much of his work had been shaped by that single voice. He closed the journal slowly and held it to his chest. "I don't think I ever said thank you. Not really." The clock ticked softly in the background. He stood, went to his desk and pulled out a legal pad. He began to write. Not a script, not a letter, but something in between. A reflection, a confession, a tribute. Because now he knew the truth. He hadn't just been taught how to act. He had been taught how to listen. And somehow, he had never truly heard what Mr. Hargrove had given him until this moment, sitting in the dark, with a journal full of whispered truths from a man the world forgot. But Keanu hadn't forgotten, and now he couldn't ignore it anymore. Keanu sat back and let the weight of it all settle in. The journal still rested near his hand, as if it were alive, breathing with memories, echoing with the voice of a man who had once whispered purpose into a 15-year-old boy lost in the noise of his own doubts. The room was dim, the light over the table soft and golden, like a quiet stage light warming a single actor in a final scene. He turned the journal over and saw something he hadn't noticed before. A folded piece of paper tucked into the back pocket. The edges were frayed and the ink had faded, but it was still legible. The title read simply, "For Keanu." His chest tightened. Hands trembling slightly, he unfolded it and began to read. "If you're reading this, it means you've kept this journal. Maybe you've even read it. I hope you have. Because you were never just a student, Keanu. You were proof that silence could carry strength. I watched you take every scar, every hesitation, and turn it into something graceful. Never let anyone tell you that being quiet is the same as being weak." Keanu paused and looked at the wall in front of him, now seeing not drywall but a stage, a memory. "I don't know where life will take you. I don't know if I'll still be around when you find this. But I do know that people like you don't come around often. You see things most people miss. You feel for those who can't speak. That is your gift. That is your burden. And that will be your greatness if you let it." Keanu closed his eyes. The letter felt like a hand on his shoulder, steadying him through time. Don't let the world harden you. And when they try to put you on a pedestal, remember the stage always belongs to everyone, not just the loudest, not just the most beautiful, but the ones brave enough to make space for others. That's what acting is. That's what humanity is. Make space, Keanu. Always make space. He set the letter down. His eyes burned, but there was no sadness now. Only awe. Only gratitude. He reached for his phone and opened the Notes app. He typed one sentence. "He never stopped teaching me." Then he saved it. That night, before going to bed, Keanu placed the journal beside his pillow. He didn't want to shelve it just yet. There was still more to learn, more to feel, more to carry forward. As he turned out the light and lay back in the darkness, he whispered to no one and everyone, "Thank you." Not out of guilt, not out of grief, but from the deepest part of his soul that now understood his path had never been walked alone. Even in the years when he thought he had been forgotten, the voice of Nathaniel Hargrove had always been with him, written between the lines. Keanu couldn't sleep after reading the journal. The words had shaken something loose in him, but they also raised more questions than they answered. The ache in his chest wasn't just from gratitude anymore. It was from confusion. Why would a man like Mr. Hargrove disappear? Why would someone so wise, so quietly powerful, vanish without a trace for nearly 4 decades? By morning, Keanu had made up his mind. He called Jessica, his longtime assistant and now his production coordinator. Her voice was crisp, even at 6:30 a.m., and she didn't hesitate when he asked for help. "I need you to dig into someone's past," he said softly. "It's personal." She didn't ask questions. Name: Nathaniel Hargrove. Taught drama in Toronto. Left sometime around 1987. No trace since. Within hours, Keanu's home office became a mini investigative center. Jessica had already begun pulling school records, archived newspaper clippings, and faculty listings from the mid-1980s. By afternoon, a few pieces had surfaced. But they didn't add up. "He's practically scrubbed from the system," Jessica said during a video call, frustrated. School records from 1987 list him as resigning for personal reasons. No mention of retirement, no farewell event, no archived yearbook quotes. Just gone. Keanu leaned forward. What about before 1987? Any drama department recognition, awards, mentions in the school paper? Plenty. He was nominated for Teacher of the Year in '85, directed 10 consecutive school plays. He mentored the city's winning monologue team 3 years in a row, but all that stops dead in 1987. It didn't sit right. This wasn't just retirement. This was erasure. Keanu stared out the window, mind spinning. Someone wanted him gone. Quietly. Jessica hesitated. "I did find one reference. It's a school board memo. Not public. It was buried inside a scanned personnel file. One line caught my attention." She read it slowly. "Following the internal concern raised by a student in April, Mr. Hargrove has opted to resign to preserve the school's integrity. No further action recommended to protect all parties." Keanu's hands clenched. "A student made a complaint?" "Yes, but that's all the file says. No police report, no media coverage, nothing else." That sounds like a cover-up, Keanu said, his voice low. Jessica nodded. If there had been a serious investigation, there'd be a record. Keanu sat in silence for a long moment. He felt the weight of what wasn't being said, the whisper of scandal, the convenience of silence, the abandonment of truth. I want to know what happened, he said firmly. All of it. Jessica gave a slow nod. I'll keep digging, but Keanu, if this really was false and he was forced out anyway, then he's been carrying someone else's lie for 40 years, Keanu said quietly. And he never told me, because he thought protecting a child was more important than clearing his name. The silence that followed was thunderous, and Keanu knew now he had to bring the truth into the light, not just for himself, but for the man who taught him what truth really meant. The next day, Jessica called back with something heavier in her voice. Keanu braced himself. I found someone, she said softly. A woman named Tara Whitmore. She was a student at the school in 1987, now works as a therapist in Montreal. She's agreed to talk. Keanu nodded slowly. Did she know Mr. Hargrove? Jessica paused. She's the one who made the complaint. The room went still. She made the complaint? Keanu asked, stunned. Jessica clarified. Yes, but there's more. She's the one who wants to talk to you. She said she's been waiting decades to say something. 2 days later, Keanu met Tara in a quiet garden behind a counseling center. She was in her late 40s now, soft-spoken and composed, with intelligent eyes that looked like they carried too many years. When Keanu introduced himself, she gave a sad smile. I know who you are, she said. I watched your early films and wondered if you ever knew. He sat across from her, unsure how to begin. She did it for him. I lied, she said plainly. About Mr. Hargrove. I lied, and they let him disappear. Keanu didn't speak. He just let her continue. I was 16, insecure, angry. I didn't get the lead in the school play. And I convinced myself it was because Mr. Hargrove didn't like me. I told the counselor he made me uncomfortable. I didn't mean for it to go far, but it did. I never expected him to resign. She paused, taking a deep breath. But the school didn't want trouble. They were more afraid of press than truth, so they told him it was better if he left quietly. And he agreed. He said he didn't want to risk hurting my reputation, even though he had done nothing wrong. Keanu felt his jaw clench. His hands tightened on his knees. He left to protect you? Tara nodded, tears beginning to form. He could have destroyed me. He didn't. He just vanished. And I've lived with that guilt for decades. No one ever asked questions. No one tried to help him. I even wrote him letters, but I never knew where he went. Keanu looked down at the journal still in his hand. That same man had written page after page about compassion, empathy, service, and had paid for it with his entire life. I need to ask, Keanu said gently. Why tell me now? She wiped her eyes. Because I saw him in one of your behind-the-scenes videos, sweeping the floor at your studio. I froze, and I realized if I didn't speak now, I never would. Keanu sat back, heart pounding with a mix of fury, grief, and awe. Mr. Hargrove had sacrificed his entire career, his identity, for a student who had accused him unjustly, and he'd never once tried to clear his name. He just left. Keanu left the garden with a strange tightness in his chest. He didn't feel anger toward Tara, at least not the kind that burned. It was something deeper, a sadness. For all the lives altered by a single moment of insecurity, for a man who had poured light into hundreds of students, only to vanish without protest when that light was snuffed out by silence. Back at home, Keanu sat with the truth. He didn't rush to call Nate. He didn't even write him a letter. Instead, he went back to the journal and read it again. This time, with new eyes. The quiet dignity in every page suddenly made sense. The refusal to complain. The insistence on humility. The emphasis on helping others feel seen rather than demanding to be seen himself. It was all there. Mr. Hargrove had built his philosophy not from theory, but from sacrifice. Jessica called again the next morning. "I've confirmed it. The complaint was withdrawn in writing years later, but no one ever reopened the case. The school buried it, even when the truth came out. No apology, no public correction, nothing." Keanu rubbed his forehead. He's been living under the shadow of something he didn't do for almost 40 years, and no one even tried to fix it. Jessica's voice broke slightly. "Do you want to go public?" He didn't answer right away. A part of him wanted justice, wanted headlines to scream out that Nathaniel Hargrove was innocent, that the system failed him. But another part remembered the man himself, the man who had walked away without bitterness, who had protected a teenager from destruction even at the cost of his name. "I don't think he wants that," Keanu said finally. "At least not yet." "But he deserves the truth," Jessica said. Keanu nodded. "Yes, but maybe not through a press release. He deserves to be seen, not exposed." That night, Keanu stood in his hallway, looking at the framed poster of Hamlet from his first school play. It had been with him through countless apartments, studios, and homes. He'd always thought it was about beginnings, but now it felt like an unfinished chapter. He touched the frame gently, then turned and walked into his study. He picked up his phone and began typing a message. Then he stopped. This couldn't be said in a message. This had to be said face to face. He picked up the journal, tucked it under his arm, and quietly left his house. Some truths were too sacred for headlines. Some men deserved more than an apology. They deserved a return, a second act, one where silence finally gave way, not to noise, but to recognition. And Keanu was ready to make sure the man who had once saved his voice could finally be heard again. This time without fear, this time with dignity. Keanu stood once again outside the small senior apartment building, gripping the weathered journal in his hand. The sun had already dipped behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the narrow sidewalk. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. This wasn't just a visit. It was a reckoning. He climbed the stairs slowly. Each step felt like walking through years of silence, of injustice, of memories that had no place to land. When he reached the door, he hesitated only once before knocking. There was a shuffle inside. Then a familiar voice, quieter than he remembered, called out, "Who is it?" "It's me," Keanu said gently. The door creaked open. Mr. Hargrove stood in the frame, his posture slightly bent, eyes wary. He wore a faded flannel shirt and old slippers, but his face was still sharp. Behind him, the apartment remained unchanged. Playbills on the wall, shelves lined with dusty books, a single reading lamp casting warm light. "You shouldn't be here," Nate said, voice low. "I know," Keanu replied, "but I came anyway." A long pause. Then, with visible reluctance, Nate stepped aside. Keanu entered quietly, letting the door shut behind him. He stood in the center of the room, glancing once more at the photos of smiling students, theater performances, and faculty gatherings. Ghosts of a life interrupted. "I know what happened," Keanu said softly, "back in 1987. I know the accusation was false. I spoke to her. I've seen the school records. I know the truth." Nate didn't move. His hands trembled slightly at his sides. Keanu continued, "You didn't defend yourself. You walked away to protect someone who hurt you." Nate finally spoke. "It wasn't about me. It never was." "That's the problem," Keanu said, stepping closer. "You thought you had to disappear because of one moment. But what about the hundreds of lives you did change? What about the students who found their voices because of you? What about me? Nate looked up at him then, eyes flickering with something between sorrow and disbelief. I thought good intentions weren't enough, Nate whispered. If someone can misinterpret even kindness, maybe it's better to stay in the shadows. Safer for everyone. Keanu reached into his coat and held out the journal. You gave me this when I was 16. I never told you what it meant. I never told anyone. But I read it during my worst days, on movie sets, in hotel rooms, at my sister's hospital bedside. And every time, it reminded me why I keep going. He opened to the page with the underlined quote. Don't act to be seen, act so others feel seen. You wrote this, Keanu said, voice tight with emotion. And it saved me. Nate stared at the journal as if seeing it for the first time. I'm here, Keanu continued, because you're still writing the story, whether you want to or not. Nate sat down slowly, as if his knees could no longer hold the weight of what he'd just heard. His eyes remained fixed on the open journal in Keanu's hands. The silence stretched between them, full of everything they had never said. Keanu stayed standing, watching the man who had once carried an entire generation of young dreamers on his back, now struggling to believe he had ever mattered at all. You think I'm some kind of hero, Nate said finally, his voice dry and distant. But I broke the code. I left. I didn't stay and fight. I let fear win. Keanu shook his head. No, you chose compassion over pride. You didn't fight because you were protecting a girl who didn't know what she was doing. That's not weakness. That's strength most people never even understand. Nate leaned back, his hands resting on his lap. I kept telling myself that for years. But then the silence became a prison. One day I woke up and realized no one even remembered I existed. That's not true, Keanu said, lowering himself into the chair across from him. I remembered. I tried to find you. When I made it big, I looked for your name in every school archive, every yearbook. You were gone. I changed my name, Nate said quietly. Didn't want to bring shame to anyone. Keanu blinked slowly. You changed your name so no one could find you, so no one would offer you a hand. Nate nodded. A long pause followed. The hum of a heater was the only sound in the room. Keanu could feel the ache in his chest building. This man, his mentor, his spark, had lived in exile believing it was the right thing. And maybe, in that era, it had been the only thing he could do, but that didn't mean it had to end there. Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out a small folded envelope. This is a letter from her, from Tara. Nate's breath caught, his shoulders stiffened. She's ready to tell the truth, Keanu said. She's carried the weight for a long time, but she finally wants you to know she's sorry, and that she knows what she took from you. Nate stared at the envelope like it was burning. I can't read it, he said softly. Then let me, Keanu replied. He opened the letter and began, voice calm, clear, and without judgment. Dear Mr. Hargrove, I have lived nearly 4 decades with a lie, and you have lived nearly 4 decades with its punishment. I was young, jealous, and angry. I wanted attention, and I hurt you to get it. You didn't deserve what happened to you, and I want the world to know you were a good man. You still are. Keanu paused, watching Nate's eyes glass over, but the older man didn't cry. He only whispered, She was a child. I always knew. Keanu folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table between them. Neither man moved for a moment. Then Nate reached out, slowly, and rested his fingertips on the edge of the paper, as if touching it too firmly might undo everything. I don't want pity, Nate said quietly. That's why I stayed hidden. I didn't want people to look at me and see someone broken. Keanu leaned forward. Then don't stay hidden. Let them see someone whole. Someone who fell and still chose grace. That's not pity, Nate. That's honor. Nate shook his head. It's too late. I'm 85. What could I possibly offer now? Keanu stood, walked to the shelf, and took down an old photograph. One of Nate in his 30s, mid-rehearsal with a group of teenagers around him. He turned it gently to face him. You still have that man in you. You're still that teacher. Teaching what? Nate asked, his voice nearly breaking. Keanu held up the journal again. Teaching what this taught me. Empathy, discipline, truth. You said once that acting is about helping others feel seen. Don't you see it now? You helped me feel seen. You helped hundreds of us. And I'm standing here to return that favor. Nate finally looked at him directly. The defenses were lowering, slowly. But shame is a stubborn shadow. I can't go back to the classroom, Nate said. I'm not asking you to, Keanu replied. I'm asking you to stand in the light again, even if it's just for one moment, even if it's just with me. There was a long silence. Then Keanu pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat pocket. I'm producing a short film, he said. It's a tribute to mentors, to unsung heroes. It's called The Quiet Ones, and I want you to help me write it. Nate blinked, stunned. Why would anyone care what I have to say? Because it saved my life, Keanu said, and because silence didn't serve you then. But it can serve you now, if you choose to break it on your terms. For the first time in the entire conversation, Nate didn't speak. He simply nodded, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but enough. Keanu smiled gently. Then it starts here, with us, with this room, with the truth. Nate looked down at the journal in Keanu's hand and finally accepted it back. His fingers lingered on the worn cover, the edges softened by time and travel and meaning. I never thought I'd see this again, he said. I never stopped carrying it, Keanu replied. As Keanu stood to leave, Nate rose too. They didn't embrace. They didn't need to. The air between them had changed. The weight had shifted. Redemption had entered quietly, like a late visitor who knocks gently instead of demanding the door. And this time, Nate didn't turn it away. He let it in. 2 weeks later, Nate received a call from Keanu. It was a simple invitation. Come to the old Bloor Street Theater. Saturday night. No cameras, just stories. Nate was hesitant, but Keanu's voice was calm and warm and firm. And so, on a brisk evening just after sunset, Nate slowly made his way across town. The cab ride felt longer than it was, winding not just through traffic, but through memory. He hadn't been to the theater district in years, not since everything fell apart. The Bloor Street Theater looked the same, modest and weathered, with a classic marquee lit in white bulbs. But tonight, no film was advertised. Instead, it simply read, "For Mr. Hargrove, one night only." Nate froze. He took a step back, confused, looking around as if there might have been a mistake. The usher at the door smiled. "We've been waiting for you, sir." Inside, the house lights were low. Nate walked in slowly, his cane tapping the carpet. The seats were mostly full. People turned. A few gasped softly, and then, one by one, they began to rise. Applause erupted, not the kind offered politely, but the kind that bursts from hearts full of gratitude. Nate stopped at the edge of the aisle, overwhelmed. Faces came into focus, faces aged by time but familiar in their foundation. Students, dozens of them. Keanu stepped into the light and walked toward him with a smile that said everything. "I told you," he whispered. "You're still writing the story." They led Nate to a seat near the front, and when he sat, the clapping slowed and settled. The small stage was bare, except for a microphone, a stool, and a backdrop of dim blue lighting. One by one, former students rose from their seats and took the stage. The first was a man named Ethan Cho, now a successful television director. He had directed over 100 episodes of primetime drama, but tonight, his voice trembled like it had back in high school. "I was terrified of being seen," Ethan said, looking straight at Nate. "You made me feel like I deserved to be seen. You told me that nervousness was just excitement in disguise." That line carried me through every pitch meeting, every camera rehearsal, every moment I thought I wasn't good enough. I wouldn't be where I am without you. The second speaker was Marissa Tran, now a trauma therapist in Chicago. She had been soft-spoken and nearly invisible as a teen, but now she stood strong, grounded in her presence. "Mr. Hargrove didn't just teach us how to perform," she said. "He taught us how to feel. When I was 17, I couldn't express pain out loud. He gave me monologues that felt like secret passwords into my own heart. That's what inspired me to help others find their voices too." Nate sat motionless, hands clenched together. His eyes shimmered, but he had not yet spoken. The third voice came from the back of the room. A woman in her 50s stepped forward, hesitating at first. "I never thought I'd get to say this," she began. "My name is Rachel Linden. I was in your drama class, senior year. You probably don't remember this, but one afternoon you found me crying behind the curtains. You didn't ask questions. You just sat next to me and told me I wasn't alone." She paused, eyes welling up. "You didn't know, but I was planning to end my life that week." Rachel's voice cracked as she continued. "I'd already written a note. I'd already picked a day. But something about the way you sat there, like you had all the time in the world just to be with me, it stopped everything. You told me, we don't always need to know what to say. Sometimes we just need to stay. That moment saved my life, literally." A hush settled across the theater. Every head turned toward Nate. His chest rose and fell, hands trembling in his lap. For years, he'd lived with the quiet ache of irrelevance. The idea that his legacy had vanished with his resignation. But now, the truth was louder than any silence he had endured. Keanu stood from the side of the stage and gently helped Nate up. Nate walked slowly toward the microphone, cane in hand, every step deliberate, heavy with emotion. He looked out at the crowd of faces, many of whom had come from across the country just to be there. Former students, artists, parents, teachers, friends. He cleared his throat, then spoke softly. "I didn't think I'd be remembered. I didn't think I deserved to be. For years I told myself that quiet was safer than truth. But seeing you all here tonight..." He paused, voice shaking. "I realize I was wrong." He looked at Rachel, who was wiping tears from her eyes in the second row. "I remember that day, and I remember wishing I had the right words for you. I didn't. I still don't. But I'm so grateful. You're still here." He turned toward Ethan and Marissa. "And I remember the moments you all struggled, not because you were weak, but because you were human. And all I ever wanted was to give you a space where that was allowed." The audience held its breath. I don't know if I ever did it right, but I see now it mattered. Keanu joined him on stage and gently put a hand on his shoulder. "It mattered more than you know," Keanu said. A standing ovation followed. Long, unbroken, the kind of applause that fills a person's soul rather than their ego. Nate didn't bow. He didn't wave. He simply stood still, his head lowered, hands pressed together in front of his chest as though in prayer or surrender. After the applause faded, Keanu leaned in and whispered something that only Nate heard. Whatever it was, it made Nate close his eyes, just for a second, and let a single tear fall. They sat together in the front row as more stories were shared, some funny, some painful, all deeply personal. The night stretched on, not as a performance, but as a collective memory finding its voice again. By the end, Nate had stopped trembling. He stood taller when he exited the theater, no longer just a man who'd been lost in time, but a man reclaimed by the people whose lives he had touched. Keanu walked beside him into the night, and for the first time in years, Nate Hargrove walked without looking down. A few days after the reunion, Keanu and Nate sat together in a quiet cafe tucked into a corner of West Hollywood. The buzz of conversation around them was distant, muffled by the soft jazz playing through old speakers. Keanu had chosen this place for a reason: familiar, private, unpretentious, just like Nate. The server refilled their coffee mugs and slipped away without a word. Nate stared at the steam rising from his cup, his fingers tracing the edge slowly, methodically. Keanu waited patiently. "I'm still overwhelmed," Nate finally said. "I never expected any of that. Those kids, what they said. I still don't know how to process it." Keanu leaned forward. "Maybe you don't need to. Maybe you just need to accept it." "I don't know if I can," Nate admitted. "You don't understand, Keanu. That night, the night I resigned, I told myself I didn't deserve to be trusted again. I didn't fight it because part of me believed I had failed. Even if the accusation was false, the doubt lived in me like a truth." Keanu nodded. "But it wasn't the truth, and now you know that. You gave them everything you had, and they carried it with them. You changed their lives. That's real. That's yours." Nate didn't respond. He just looked out the window at the passing cars. Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. "There's something I want to show you." He slid the folder across the table. Nate opened it slowly. Inside were documents, proposals, and a few typed pages with a heading, "The Still Voice Project." He looked up, puzzled. "It's something I've been working on," Keanu explained. "A drama and storytelling workshop for underprivileged youth in LA. Kids who've been through a lot: foster care, juvenile detention, homelessness, the kind of kids no one listens to. I want to give them a place to express, to speak, to feel seen." Nate flipped through the pages in silence. "I've got the space, I've got the funding, but what I don't have is a teacher. Not just any teacher. Someone who knows what it's like to really listen. Someone who understands what it means to make people feel safe enough to speak." He paused. "I want you, Nate." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Nate looked stunned. He closed the folder slowly and pushed it back toward Keanu. "I'm not the man I used to be. I'm old, slower. I can't keep up with today's kids, and I've been out of the world too long." Keanu didn't reach for the folder. "I'm not asking you to be fast or modern. I'm asking you to show up, to share what's inside you. That's all they need." Nate shook his head. "It's not enough." Keanu didn't blink. "It was enough for me." Nate opened his mouth, then closed it again. "The world didn't ask you to stop teaching," Keanu said softly. "It just forgot how to listen. I think it's ready now, and I think you are too." Nate stared down at the folder once more. "I'm scared," he said. Keanu smiled. "Good. That means you still care." For a while, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them wasn't awkward. It was full of things that didn't need to be said. Nate reached once more for the folder, his fingers brushing over the top sheet, reading lines he hadn't yet fully absorbed. The curriculum outline, the student profiles, the mission statement Keanu had typed himself. "What would I even say to them?" Nate finally asked. "What do I tell a kid who's seen the inside of a jail cell before their 16th birthday?" "You tell them the truth," Keanu replied. "That silence can be survival, but it doesn't have to be the end. You tell them that their voice matters, even if it shakes. Especially if it shakes." Nate exhaled, shaky. "I haven't stood in front of a classroom in 35 years. But your words still stand inside the people you taught," Keanu said. "I'm one of them." Nate looked up at him. The man across the table wasn't a kid anymore. He was a world-renowned actor, a public figure, someone whose life was known in headlines. But in that moment, Keanu's eyes held the same sincerity they had in 1982. A quiet reverence that said, "I'm still learning from you." Nate closed the folder and placed his hand on top of it. You really think I can make a difference again? Keanu didn't hesitate. You already did, this is just continuing. Nate sat back in his chair, rubbing his chin as the reality of the offer sank in. He thought about the theater reunion, about Rachel's voice trembling as she shared her pain. He thought about Ethan's laugh, Marissa's hug. All those lives still blooming after all these years. Maybe he wasn't asking for a second act. Maybe the first one had never ended. When would it start? Nate asked quietly. Keanu grinned. Orientation's in 2 weeks. We're partnering with 3 community centers, so we'll rotate spaces. No pressure to commit full-time, just come, see what it feels like. Nate took a sip of his now cold coffee and looked out the window again. The traffic light turned green. A couple walked past, holding hands. Somewhere in the distance, a child's laugh echoed off the pavement. 2 weeks, he repeated, almost to himself. I'll think about it. Keanu nodded. That's all I ask. They walked out of the cafe into the late afternoon light. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows over the sidewalk. Nate paused and looked up at the sky, as if trying to gauge something only he could see. You know, he said slowly, when I was young, I thought teaching was about filling people with knowledge. But it wasn't. It was about holding space, letting them become. Keanu placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Exactly. And in that moment, Nate Hargrove didn't feel like a man out of time anymore. He felt like a bridge. Not forgotten. Not finished. Just ready. The door creaked as Nate Hargrove stepped into the rehearsal room. It was nothing like the polished stages he remembered. The floors were scuffed, the walls lined with cracked mirrors, and the air carried a faint trace of bleach and old sweat. But it was enough. It was real. A dozen teens sat in uneven chairs arranged in a wide semicircle. They looked up as the old man entered, some with curiosity, others with suspicion, and a few with blank stares carved from survival. Keanu stood near the back, arms crossed gently, watching without interfering. He gave Nate a small nod, then stepped into the shadows to let him lead. Nate adjusted his tie a little tighter than it needed to be and walked to the center of the room. He didn't start with a big introduction. He just looked at the students, one by one, letting the silence breathe between them. My name is Mr. Hargrove, he said softly. You can call me Nate if you like. I'm here because someone once told me the quietest voices are often the ones that carry the most truth. He let that sit for a moment. I'm not here to teach you how to act, he continued. I'm here to show you what it feels like when your story matters. A girl with purple braids crossed her arms tightly. A boy near the back shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. One kid yawned deliberately. Nate smiled gently. You don't have to speak today. You don't have to perform. But I want to try something. He stepped closer to the group, his voice calm and unforced. Close your eyes. No one moved. He chuckled lightly. You can peek if you want, but just try. Close your eyes. Slowly, a few students complied. Others followed reluctantly, casting nervous glances before surrendering to the request. I want you to imagine the hardest thing you've ever felt, Nate said quietly. Not something someone else told you was hard. Something you felt. Something that sat in your chest and refused to move. The room went still. Now, imagine that feeling had a voice. Not words, a voice, a sound. What would it say? What would it sound like? Even Keanu felt the heaviness of the question. For some, it might whisper. For others, it might scream. Some of you might hear silence, and that's okay too. Nate let the silence stretch out, wrapping around the room like a fragile blanket. Then he said, "Open your eyes." When they did, something had shifted. Not everything, but enough. A boy near the center cleared his throat. It would sound like my mom slamming the door. Every night. Girl next to him whispered, "Mine would sound like glass breaking." Another voice piped up, "Mine doesn't make noise, it just echoes." Nate didn't try to analyze or correct them, he just nodded. "That's what theater is," he said. "It's giving your pain a voice. It's giving your silence a shape." The tension in the room began to loosen. Shoulders dropped, eyes met. A few even smiled faintly. And that's when Nate picked up a worn-out copy of Hamlet from a nearby table and handed it to the boy who had mentioned his mom. "Can you read this line for me?" he asked. "Just the first sentence." The boy looked down at the page. "What line?" Nate pointed. "To be or not to be. Just that." The boy read it, awkward and unsure. Nate nodded. "Say it again, but this time say it like you're standing in front of that door, the one that always slams." The boy hesitated, then did, and for the first time, it didn't sound like Shakespeare. It sounded like truth. The room fell quiet after the boy finished. No one laughed. No one shifted uncomfortably. Even the girl with the crossed arms uncrossed them, watching him now with something close to awe. Nate gave a small nod, his eyes glistening. "Then," he said gently, "is what it means to be heard." For the next 20 minutes, Nate invited a few more students to read. He didn't push them. He didn't instruct like a director. He guided, encouraged, listened. One by one, they stepped forward. One read lines from a script Nate had brought. Another simply described the smell of the soup kitchen she'd grown up in as if it were a monologue. Another stood up and said nothing at all, but his hands trembled as he held the paper, and everyone noticed. They weren't perfect. Some stumbled, some whispered too low to hear, but none of that mattered. Keanu watched from the back, arms crossed again, but this time his eyes were full of something deeper than pride. It was reverence. He saw his younger self in every awkward step, every uncertain line. He remembered the first time Mr. Hargrove had asked him to read aloud, how terrifying and exhilarating it had been. And now, that same quiet miracle was unfolding again. Nate walked over to the whiteboard and wrote one sentence. "You are not broken." He circled it. "This is what I need you to remember," he said. "Art isn't about proving anything. It's about uncovering what's already inside you, and letting someone else feel it too." One of the girls raised her hand timidly. "Are we going to do a play?" Nate smiled. "Maybe. But first we're going to find out who we are. Then we'll decide who we want to be." By the end of the class, something had changed. The walls didn't feel as cold. The students didn't look like strangers to each other. They laughed. A few cried. One girl gave Nate a crumpled drawing she'd made of the class. It wasn't perfect, but it had heart. As the room slowly emptied, Keanu stepped forward. Nate turned to him, still holding the drawing. "You were right," Nate said, his voice soft. "They listened." Keanu looked at him, eyes full of emotion. "They didn't just listen, Nate. They heard you. Just like I did." Nate took a long breath, blinking away tears he wasn't ready to release in front of the students. "I didn't think I still had it in me." "You never lost it," Keanu replied. "The world just forgot where to find you." Outside, the sun had dipped low, casting a golden wash through the windows of the center. The hallway echoed with distant laughter, and somewhere in the background, a student played with a piano key they'd found near the supply closet. As Nate turned off the classroom lights, he glanced once more at the whiteboard. "You are not broken." He didn't erase it. He just nodded, turned, and walked out, knowing for the first time in decades that his voice still had power, and that someone, somewhere, was ready to listen. The room was quiet, the air thick with something more than anticipation. Keanu had chosen a small, private library tucked behind a community center in Pasadena. There were no cameras, no press, no audience. Just a circular table, 2 glasses of water, and the weight of a truth long buried. Nate Hargrove sat upright, his posture disciplined as always, though his hands trembled slightly. He wore the same gray sweater he'd worn to the youth center last week. He didn't know what to expect. Keanu had only said, "There's someone who needs to speak to you. Someone from your past." And then the door opened. A woman in her mid-40s stepped in slowly, her eyes already glistening. She clutched her coat tightly around her as if holding herself together. Nate stood instinctively, his manners still intact, but his eyes searched her face with visible confusion. She spoke first. "Mr. Hargrove, it's me, Lisa Monroe." Nate's breath caught in his throat. The name struck something deep inside. He blinked hard, trying to process the face before him, aged but familiar. The girl with the braided ponytail and the bruises she never explained. The one who used to stay after class just to sit in the quiet. Lisa stepped forward, hesitantly. "You probably don't want to see me. I wouldn't blame you if you asked me to leave right now." Nate shook his head slowly. "Sit," he said softly. "Please." She lowered herself into the chair across from him and stared at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I've wanted to say this for years, decades actually, but I never had the courage. And then, life just kept moving. But when I saw the reunion photos online, when I saw you, I knew I had to come." Nate waited. He didn't interrupt. He just watched her face, lined with sorrow. "I lied," she whispered. "I told the school you touched me inappropriately. And it wasn't true. None of it was true." Nate's breath hitched, but he said nothing. "I was 16. I was angry. I was so broken and I didn't know how to talk about it. You were the only adult who ever really saw me. You noticed when I skipped lunch. You asked when my eyes were swollen. And I didn't know how to handle that kind of kindness. No one had ever given it without asking for something in return." She paused, wiping tears from her cheek. "My stepfather was hurting me. For years, I was terrified and ashamed. And I guess I lashed out at the only person who wasn't hurting me. Because you were safe. And I knew if I said something, someone would believe me." Nate finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "And they did." Lisa nodded slowly, the shame in her eyes almost unbearable. "Nathan forced you out. You lost your job, your career, and I watched it all happen from my window, and I said nothing. I thought it would make me feel powerful, but it didn't. It made me feel worse." Nate leaned back, his hands folded in front of him now. The silence was thick, but not angry, just heavy. "I always wondered," he said gently. "But I never hated you. Not once." Lisa looked up, startled. "I was angry at myself, for not being stronger, for not pushing back. But I saw what you were going through, even if you didn't see me. And I knew, deep down, I wasn't the only one hurting." Lisa covered her mouth, trying to stop the sob that broke from her throat. She hadn't expected kindness. She hadn't expected anything but the righteous anger she thought she deserved. But here he was, Mr. Hargrove, older now, worn down by years of silence, and yet offering her something she had never received. Understanding. "I ruined your life," she whispered. Nate reached across the table and gently placed his hand on hers. "You were a child," he said, "and so was I, in many ways. I didn't know how to protect you. I failed you then. But I don't blame you for surviving the only way you knew how." Lisa couldn't stop crying. She gripped his hand as if it were a lifeline. "I've lived with this every day. I never taught again. I never worked in schools. I've done everything I could to try and make it right in small ways. I mentor girls now, but it never felt like enough." "It doesn't erase the past," Nate said, his voice steady now. "But this, right here, this matters. Thank you for telling me." She looked into his eyes, searching for resentment, but found none. Only a quiet ache, the kind that had settled into his bones long ago. "I hope you can forgive me," she said. "I already have," he replied. Keanu stood just outside the door, watching from the shadows. He had stayed back to give them privacy, but even from where he stood, the energy in the room shifted. He saw the weight begin to lift from both of them. Lisa's shoulders were no longer hunched with shame. Nate's expression no longer carried the haunted guilt of a man who thought he had been forgotten for the worst of reasons. The moment was quiet, intimate, and deeply human. Two people burdened by a shared pain had finally unburdened it. After a while, Lisa stood and walked toward the door. As she passed Keanu, she stopped and turned to him. "Thank you," she said. "You gave me back a piece of my soul." Keanu nodded. "No one deserves to carry shame they didn't earn. You did the hardest thing." She left the building, the air outside suddenly fresh, like she could breathe again. Inside, Nate remained seated at the table, still processing everything. He reached for the glass of water, but his hand paused halfway. He looked at the spot where Lisa had been sitting and let out a long, slow exhale. Keanu entered quietly and took the seat across from him. "I didn't know if she'd come," Keanu said. "She almost didn't, but she wanted to. Needed to." Nate nodded. She was still just a kid. Hurt people hurt others. But sometimes they heal too. "That's the piece that was missing," Keanu said softly. "You kept teaching all your life, even when you thought you weren't. Even in silence, you were still giving." Nate looked at him with tired but open eyes. "Maybe now I can finally forgive myself." Keanu reached into his coat and handed him the old journal again. "Then write it down. Not for them, not for me, for you." Nate ran his hand along the cover, his fingertips brushing the worn leather. He didn't say anything, but the tears in his eyes spoke volumes. For the first time in decades, his past no longer held him hostage. It had set him free. The curtains were still drawn. The stage was dim. Backstage, Keanu stood beside Nate, both watching the students from their workshop flutter around with last-minute nerves. Tonight was opening night of their original play, Whispers of the Forgotten. A story written by the students, a story shepherded by Nate, a story funded quietly and fully by Keanu Reeves. Nate adjusted his tie in the mirror, looking at his reflection like it belonged to someone else. The old man in the glass didn't look like the same teacher who once paced high school stages in the ADS, but his eyes still held that same fire, softened now with wisdom and tempered by pain. "You ready?" Keanu asked quietly. Nate exhaled slowly. "Doesn't matter if I am. They are." In the auditorium, the house lights dimmed. A hush fell across the crowd. It wasn't a celebrity event. No press photos, no red carpet. Just an audience made up of parents, social workers, teachers, former students, and a few theater critics who had heard whispers about something special happening downtown. When the curtains rose, the silence deepened. The first scene opened with a spotlight on a single young actor, a girl named Naya. Once nearly expelled from her school, she now stood center stage in full command of her voice. Her monologue began softly, trembling. Then it grew. She told the story of a teenage girl who felt invisible at home, unheard in the world, until a stranger sat beside her on a park bench and listened. The dialogue wasn't flowery, it was real, honest, unpolished and aching. From the shadows backstage, Nate stood like a quiet sentinel. He didn't move, didn't blink much, afraid to miss a single breath, a single heartbeat of what his students were pouring into the lights. The next scene transitioned into a bus terminal. A teenage boy, played by Jamal, paced nervously with a backpack in his hand. The dialogue touched on themes of abandonment, fear, and resilience. When he looked out into the crowd and asked, "What do you do when even the mirror won't recognize you?" A stillness settled in the theater like snowfall. Each act was a woven memory, some fictionalized, some not. Stories of incarceration, bullying, addiction, redemption. But at their center was a shared rhythm, the power of being seen, of being heard. of being given a second chance. Nate didn't direct the show from the sidelines. He had guided the students through writing it, through performing it. But now, he let go. These weren't his lines anymore. They belonged to the kids. Between scenes, Keanu occasionally looked at Nate and saw something shifting in him. A quiet pride that didn't scream or need recognition. A man watching his voice echo through the lives of others, not through his words, but through theirs. And then, as the final act unfolded, something happened. The main character, a composite of several students' real stories, stood at the edge of the stage. He faced the audience, trembling with emotion, and said, "They said I didn't matter, but I stood on this stage and proved them wrong." The audience, which had been holding its breath, finally exhaled. As the final spotlight dimmed and the stage fell dark, the room erupted into applause. Thunderous, sustained, pure. And Nate? He didn't move. He kept his eyes fixed on the kids who took their bows, one by one. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't need to. What mattered was already in front of him. The kids were standing taller than he'd ever seen. As the applause swelled, the cast gathered in a huddle on stage, tears mixing with laughter. One of the boys, a lanky teen with a shaved head and trembling hands, looked over toward the wings where Nate stood. He raised his hand slowly and gave a small salute, eyes shimmering. Nate's lips quivered. Keanu gently nudged him forward. "Go," he whispered. But Nate shook his head. "This isn't mine, it's theirs." Still, word had spread. The audience began to chant, "Mr. Hargrove, Mr. Hargrove." And one by one the students turned toward the curtain, silently urging him forward. Nate finally stepped onto the stage. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The moment his foot touched the boards, the audience rose to their feet again, louder than before. Some clapped, others cried. But all eyes were on the man who had once disappeared in shame and now stood wrapped in redemption. Keanu remained in the shadows, arms folded, heart full. This moment wasn't about celebrity. It wasn't about charity or gestures. It was about truth, finally rising through the cracks like sunlight through broken glass. Later that night, after the theater had emptied, Nate sat alone in the front row. The students had gone, the lights were dimmed, but he stayed behind, soaking in the silence of a space filled with echoes that would never leave him. Keanu came down the aisle and sat beside him, saying nothing for a long while. Finally, Nate spoke. "I didn't think I had anything left to give." Keanu turned to him. "You didn't give anything. You awakened something." Nate chuckled quietly. "You know, I always thought my story ended when I left the school. But maybe stories don't end. Maybe they just change chapters." Keanu nodded. "This chapter matters more than all the ones before." In his hands, Nate held a folded copy of the program. On the back was a quote, chosen by the students without his knowledge. It read, "People made us feel seen. Now, it's our turn to make him unforgettable." Nate ran his fingers over the words, his hands trembling slightly. "They wrote that?" Keanu smiled. Every single word. A single tear slid down Nate's cheek. The next morning, critics would rave about the play, calling it the most human show of the year. The local news would run a short segment with photos of the students hugging their quiet mentor and audiences lining up for a second night. But Nate wouldn't read the articles. He wouldn't care for the spotlight. He'd be too busy preparing the next lesson, because the students wanted to write another show. And this time, Nate would co-write it with them from the beginning. A new tradition was forming. A forgotten man had stepped back into the light, not for himself, but to shine it on others. And Keanu? He would be there every step of the way, silent, steady, a guardian behind the curtain, just as Nate once had been for him. Some plays take years to write. Some legacies take decades to find their ending. But when the curtain falls and the house goes dark, what remains isn't the applause. It's the lives changed by the story that was finally allowed to be told. It was a quiet Sunday morning when Nate opened the bottom drawer of his old desk. The wood was worn and splintered at the edges, its handles tarnished with time. He hadn't touched it in years. Most of his belongings had been moved, boxed, or replaced, but this desk, this was where he wrote his first lesson plans, graded his students' monologues, and jotted notes about their growth. The drawer had remained stubbornly shut for decades. That day, something nudged him to open it. Inside was a clutter of old receipts, yellowing envelopes, broken pencils, and beneath it all, a sealed, unmailed letter. The handwriting on the front read, Keanu. Nate stared at it for a long time. He had forgotten about the letter entirely, or maybe he had chosen to. Slowly, he peeled the envelope open. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear. As he read, the memories rushed back like a rising tide. He had written the letter the night Keanu left Toronto. It had been raining. He had sat alone in his small apartment, devastated by the sudden departure of the boy who had reminded him what it meant to teach from the soul. At the time, Nate didn't know why Keanu had left so abruptly. He had no one to ask. But he had felt the ache of abandonment, of a goodbye never spoken. So, he wrote, but he never sent it. He told himself it didn't matter, that Keanu was gone, that the letter would never find him. But deep down, he hadn't sent it because he was afraid. Afraid that his words would come too late. Afraid they wouldn't matter. Now, holding the letter again, after 30 years, Nate quietly folded it shut. Lisa, oh. That afternoon, as Keanu arrived at the workshop, Nate pulled him aside. He held the envelope between two fingers, delicate and trembling. "This is yours," Nate said. "I wrote it a long time ago. I'm not sure why I didn't send it, but maybe it was waiting for the right time." Keanu took the letter with a soft nod. He didn't read it then. He tucked it into the inside pocket of his jacket, tapped it once, and looked Nate in the eye. "I'll read it when I'm alone." Later that night, long after the workshop had ended and the lights were dimmed in the rehearsal space, Keanu sat on his balcony, overlooking the city. He poured himself a glass of water and lit a candle beside him. The envelope was still in his jacket pocket. He removed it gently and unfolded the pages. The writing was raw, imperfect, but deeply human. It began simply, "Keanu, I don't know where you are now, or if you'll ever read this, but I need you to know something. You mattered to me, not as a student, but as a person. You reminded me of everything I loved about teaching. You asked questions that scared me. You listened in ways most adults forget how to, and you performed like the silence inside you had been waiting its whole life to speak. When you left, I didn't know how to say goodbye. I still don't. So, I'm writing this instead." Keanu's eyes welled with tears as he continued reading. The letter was part apology, part blessing, part memory. Nate wrote about a day Keanu had forgotten. A moment in rehearsal where he broke down crying during a scene. Nate had simply handed him a tissue and let the silence hold. "You didn't need correction that day," the letter read. "You needed space. And that was when I knew you'd never be just an actor. You'd be a voice." Keanu folded the letter back with reverence, hands shaking. He had spent his whole life trying to live up to that voice, and now he knew where it started. The next morning, Keanu walked into his office with the letter in hand. No script, no notes. Just the folded pages from a man who had once changed his life. His team looked up as he quietly placed the letter on the table. "This," he said, "will open the film." No one argued. They knew what it meant. Keanu recorded the voiceover himself, reading Nate's words plainly with quiet conviction. It wasn't acting. It was remembering. As the film began with his voice, soft music swelled beneath shots of abandoned school auditoriums, cracked sidewalks, and young students standing on empty stages. The documentary, titled The Ones They Forgot, was personal and raw. It didn't just tell Nate's story. It told the stories of forgotten mentors and overlooked kids. Students shared how they nearly gave up until someone saw them. Footage of Nate's class showed teens crying, laughing, and creating. It was real, it was honest. The film went viral. At first, teachers shared it online, then artists, then everyday people who knew what it felt like to be ignored. A single quote from Nate, recorded during a short interview, captured hearts worldwide. "I don't need a stage to teach. Just someone still willing to listen." That line was printed on shirts, posted on murals, and shared across continents. One student in Brazil tattooed it on her wrist. A school principal in Chicago read it at graduation. Emails poured in. The world hadn't forgotten Nate. They had just been waiting to hear him speak. Nate didn't care about the praise. He just wanted to keep teaching. And now he did, with pride, not shame. One afternoon, while students rehearsed, a girl looked up from her lines and asked, "Mr. Nate, do you think people like us can actually change the world?" He didn't hesitate. "You already have." From the back of the room, Keanu watched in silence. No cameras, no applause. Just the man who had once told him he was meant to speak for the quiet ones, now speaking to the next generation, in a voice the world finally heard. The room was lit with soft golds and warm shadows, echoing the dignity of the moment. 1,000 people had gathered inside the grand ballroom of the National Educational Impact Conference in Chicago. Educators, artists, and mentors from every corner of the country sat in quiet anticipation. On the center stage, a banner hung above a polished podium. Lifetime Achievement in Human Development and the Arts. Keanu sat in the front row, dressed in a modest black suit, his expression calm but his hands slightly trembling. This was the moment he had dreamed of giving back, one he wasn't sure would ever come. He glanced to his side as Nate Hargrove, now 85, sat next to him. Nate's hands rested on his knees, wrinkled and strong, but shaking just enough that he needed help when the presenter called his name. Please welcome our recipient of this year's Lifetime Achievement Award, Mr. Nathaniel Hargrove. The room erupted in a standing ovation. Nate blinked, stunned. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. Keanu reached down, grasped his forearm gently, and whispered, "It's your stage now." With Keanu helping him to his feet, Nate walked slowly toward the podium. Every step was measured, not from weakness, but from reverence. He passed table after table of people who had never met him before, and yet whose eyes were already filled with tears. There was something about him, about his presence, his humility, that made them feel like they knew him. Like somehow, through every life he'd touched, he had reached them too. As he reached the podium, Nate took a deep breath and steadied himself on the wooden frame. The room hushed. For a moment, he looked out into the crowd, his eyes landing on the faces of former students, fellow teachers, and strangers who had become believers. Then, he looked back at Keanu, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. Nate adjusted the microphone and spoke. "When I was a young teacher," he began, "someone told me that the best education is invisible, that it's not about what you memorize, but about who you become in the process. I believed that then. I believe it now." His voice was soft, worn with time, but clear. "I didn't set out to win awards. I didn't even set out to be remembered. I just wanted my students to walk out of a room believing they mattered, that their stories were worth telling." He paused, looking down at his folded hands. When he raised his head again, his eyes were moist. "The best teachers," he said, "don't just teach subjects. They teach you how to be yourself, how to listen to the silence in your own soul, how to speak up when the world tries to shrink you." The audience sat in stunned silence, hanging on every word. "I had the honor of teaching many young people. But what most don't know is I was taught too. By them. Their bravery, their stories, their pain. He looked at Keanu once more, and some of them became actors, some became poets, some became parents, and one of them became a friend who never gave up on me. The room remained hushed, the weight of his words pulling everyone into stillness. I dedicate this award, Nate said softly, to the students who became teachers and the friends who became family. The applause continued long after Nate stepped down from the podium, but he didn't linger in the spotlight. He returned to his seat quietly, where former students leaned in with teary eyes and whispered thanks. One said, "You gave me courage when I couldn't even speak." Another, now a therapist, added, "You helped me survive." Nate nodded, humbled beyond words. He didn't need more recognition. Their voices were the reward. Later that evening, as the crowd settled after dinner, the event organizer approached Keanu. "Would you speak about Mr. Hargrove?" Keanu shook his head gently. "No words, but I do have something to show." The room darkened. A projector hummed. On the big screen, a black and white photo of a younger Nate appeared. Then came his voice, slow, sincere, trembling with time. It was the letter. The one he had written to Keanu 30 years earlier, now recorded and woven into a short documentary Keanu had quietly produced. "I never knew if I was right to push you toward the stage," Nate's voice said, "but I saw the ache behind your eyes. You didn't want fame. You wanted people to feel less alone." The audience stilled. Faces turned soft. A few hands reached for tissues. "I hope I taught you this," the voice continued. "You were never invisible. Not to me." Clips followed, of high school rehearsals, a much younger Keanu learning lines, Nate coaching students in worn-out auditoriums. No interviews, just moments. Authentic, raw, human. By the time the screen faded to black, no one clapped. Not at first. They just sat with it. Then, slowly, the applause returned, louder now, heavier with meaning. But Nate didn't look for validation. He simply watched the crowd, letting the love land without needing to hold it. Keanu leaned toward him. "You said the world forgot to listen," he whispered. "Not anymore." Nate's eyes welled, but he nodded. "You gave them something to hear." By the end of the night, educators were asking to share the documentary with schools. A university dean approached, saying, "This should be shown to every first-year teacher." Outside, under the stars, away from the noise, Nate and Keanu stood together on the steps. No spotlight, no stage, just quiet. "You did good, Mr. Hargrove," Keanu said softly. Nate looked out at the city lights, his voice barely a whisper. "They were always good kids. I just never stopped believing in them. And we'd never stopped needing you," Keanu replied. In that moment, neither man said more. They didn't need to. The silence between them was filled with everything they had built. Trust, gratitude, and a kind of love that never asks to be seen, only felt. For the first time in decades, Nate didn't question his path. He didn't wonder what could have been. The students he had once guided were now guiding others. His voice, buried for so long, had found its way back. And this time, the world was finally listening. A year had passed since the final curtain fell on Whispers of the Forgotten. The stage lights were long dimmed, but their warmth had spread far beyond the theater. In a quiet corner of Los Angeles, the outreach center bustled with a new rhythm, one built on voices that had once been silent. Keanu arrived without any cameras, no entourage, no fanfare. He preferred it that way. A cool breeze moved through the courtyard as he stepped through the wide glass doors. The halls smelled faintly of pencil shavings, floor wax, and something else. Hope. Inside the main classroom, kids sat in a circle. Some fidgeted, others stared at the floor. But one boy, maybe 12, sat cross-legged, hugging a book tightly against his chest. Its cover was worn, the pages dog-eared. Keanu paused, his eyes softening as he recognized it immediately. That same tattered copy of Hamlet. He didn't need to ask where it came from. Nate. At the back of the room, seated in a sturdy armchair with a walking cane resting nearby, sat Mr. Nathaniel Hargrove. Now just Nate to the kids. His hair had gone fully silver, his back slightly hunched, but his eyes, they still carried that same spark Keanu had seen in 1982. Nate gave Keanu a small nod and smiled. They didn't need words anymore. There was a kind of peace in their shared silence. Keanu sat next to the boy, holding the book. The kid looked up at him shyly. "You liked that one?" Keanu asked gently. The boy nodded. "It's hard, but good." "Yeah," Keanu smiled. "That's how I felt too." The boy looked down again. "He said I should try reading it out loud, that it might help. Did it?" The boy hesitated. "A little." Keanu leaned closer. "That's a start." "It helped me too, more than I ever expected." The boy studied him curiously. "You were shy." Keanu laughed quietly. "Oh, way more than shy. I used to stutter. I was scared to speak." The boy blinked. "But you..." Keanu gave a quiet shrug. "Because of him," he said, nodding toward Nate. "He didn't teach me to act. He taught me how to feel." Nate chuckled softly from the back. "And now he's teaching me how to sit still." The kids laughed, and so did Keanu. But behind the laughter, something deep was happening. Something old being passed along like a flame from candle to candle. That afternoon, Keanu stood by the large mural painted on the outer wall. It had been finished just weeks earlier by the students, each handprint and stroke a reflection of their journeys. Nate's favorite quote was painted in the center. "Don't act to be seen, act so others feel seen." Keanu looked out across the courtyard, watching the young voices rising and falling like the rustling of leaves. Then, in a quiet voice meant only for himself, and whoever needed to hear it, he said, "The boy I was found his voice because one man believed in him. That voice became my life, and now it's helping others find theirs." Later that evening, the center slowly quieted. Most of the kids had gone home. A few lingered to help clean up or ask last-minute questions. Keanu remained seated by the mural, sipping tea someone had handed him, letting the warmth settle in his chest. Nate walked over with his cane, his steps slower than they used to be, but steady. He eased onto the bench beside Keanu. "They're special, this group," Nate murmured. "Each one holding something they don't know how to name yet, but it's in them." Keanu nodded. "Like it was in me." They sat in thoughtful silence as dusk colored the sky above them in bruised purples and soft gold. Then Nate reached into his coat pocket and handed Keanu a folded slip of paper. "What's this?" Keanu asked, unfolding it carefully. Nate smiled. "One of the kids gave it to me, said I changed their life. Again. You were right. I'm not done." Keanu read the short message, just a few lines in uneven handwriting, but they said everything. "Thank you for hearing me before I even knew how to speak. I want to be like you when I grow up." He folded the note and tucked it into his jacket. "You know," Nate said, leaning back, "I used to think my time had passed, that what I'd done, both the good and the bad, had locked me out of the story. But these kids, they made me realize the story wasn't over. I was just stuck on a long, quiet page." Keanu looked at him with quiet admiration. "Sometimes the quietest pages carry the loudest truths." Nate gave a soft laugh. "You always had a way with lines." Keanu shook his head. "You wrote them first. I just remembered them." They sat under the slowly darkening sky, the hum of the city a distant echo beyond the walls of the center. Inside, a new teacher guided a small group through their first improvisation exercise. Laughter and awkward bravery drifted into the night. Then Keanu stood and turned slowly to face the invisible audience watching through a screen somewhere in the world. His voice was calm, steady, but filled with meaning. Maybe you had someone like Nate in your life, someone who saw past the noise, the fear, the mask, and called out the best in you anyway. He paused for a moment, letting the weight of the memory settle. Or maybe you were that person for someone else. Keanu looked down briefly, then back at the camera. I owe who I am to a man who disappeared before I could say thank you. I got a second chance, and I took it. Then he offered a gentle smile. If you've ever had a mentor who changed your life, tell me in the comments. And if you believe everyone deserves a second chance, share this story. You never know who it might save. Behind him, the center lights glowed warmly, casting long shadows across the courtyard. Inside, a young boy stood at the front of the classroom, holding a worn copy of Hamlet, and began to read aloud.